Boa noite a todos, sejam bem-vindos ao nosso primeiro Simpósio de Biotecnologia e Tecnologia de Produtos, SIMBITEC. Nosso objetivo é fornecer uma visão geral sobre os avanços recentes e tendências no encontro entre a biotecnologia e a tecnologia de produtos. Serão 3 noites de pura imersão e troca de informações. Contamos com a presença de todos vocês nesses 3 dias. E quem sou eu? Meu nome é Carolina, sou aluna da graduação da Universidade Federal dos Vales de Jequitinhonha e Mucuri, UFVJM, em Diamantina, Minas Gerais, Brasil. E curso Engenharia Química pela mesma. Sou aluna de iniciação científica do Laboratório de Pesquisa em Micologia, Enzimologia e Desenvolvimento de Produtos, LMDP. Sob a orientação da professora doutora Vivian Machado Benassi, o laboratório é coordenado por ela mesma e o professor Juan Bretas. Para maiores informações, nos sigam no nosso Instagram, @lmdp.ufvjm, e pelo nosso LinkedIn. Antes de mais nada, sigam o nosso canal no YouTube. Hoje teremos a pós-doutoranda Zoe, da Universidade do Texas, Estados Unidos, que irá iniciar o nosso evento científico com a apresentação sobre o tema Trabalho e Pesquisa nos Estados Unidos. Para isso, irei chamar um grande parceiro do nosso laboratório, o pós-doutorando Tiago Passim, também residente nos Estados Unidos, no Texas. O Tiago Passim é graduado em Ciências Biológicas pela Universidade de Barão de Paraúna, Barão de Marauá, mestre e doutor em Bioquímica pela USP, com período sanduíche nos Estados Unidos. Atua como pós-doutorando na Universidade do Texas, Estados Unidos, e tem experiência na área de bioquímica, enzimologia, biologia molecular e microbiologia. Boa noite, Tiago. Muito
Olá,
obrigada por
pessoal.
participar
Boa
dessa noite
noite.
conosco. Tudo bem?
Tudo bem, obrigado pelo convite, por estar aqui. Agradeço novamente ao laboratório, obrigado, Carolina, obrigado a Vivian também pela organização.
Um prazer ter vocês com a gente essa noite.
Bom, então, eu vou chamar agora a doutora Zoe Hoffbauer. A doutora Zoe tem bacharelado em Química pela Universidade do Texas, em Austin. Ela tem doutorado em Biofísica e Bioquímica pela Universidade do Texas, Medical Branch em Galveston, com uma sólida formação em ciência básica para aplicações biomédicas, e atualmente ela é pós-doutoranda na Universidade do Texas, em San Antônio, onde realiza estudos das interações proteína-proteína de enzimas da via biosintética da riboflavina para a produção de novos antibióticos. O que eu gostaria de acrescentar a essa lista é que a doutora Zoe também tem uma capacidade enorme de fazer pão de queijo. Ela faz um pão de queijo magnífico, apesar de ela não falar português fluentemente, ela tem essa brasilidade dentro dela. Então, é com muito prazer que eu apresento a vocês a doutora Zoe Hoffbauer. Welcome, Zoe.
Oi, estou feliz por estar aqui e obrigada pelo convite. I hope that was okay. I don't actually speak Portuguese. Let me share my screen so that everyone can see my presentation. Can everyone see my PowerPoint presentation? Great. Okay. So thank you all for coming this evening. Today I will be discussing work and research opportunities here in the United States, and I'm going to share with you my personal experience, but keep in mind that my experience is just one experience and that many different people have unique journeys over the course of their PhDs. So first of all, who am I? I know I've been introduced at this point, but to hear it in English, I got my BS in chemistry from the University of Texas at Austin in Austin, Texas. I did not do any undergraduate research. In fact, whenever I was in undergrad, I did a minor in education, and I wanted to become a lecturer. So in order for me to become a lecturer, I had to get a PhD. And so I then went to the University of Texas Medical Branch in Galveston to obtain a PhD. Over the course of my PhD, I studied protein structure and the allosteric regulation of human glutamate dehydrogenase, which is really important for some forms of hyperinsulinism. After completing my PhD, I went on to do a postdoc, which is sort of the most conventional route to take. And that's where I am now, is doing my first postdoc at the University of Texas at San Antonio in San Antonio, Texas. So what I'm currently doing is I'm studying enzymes involved in riboflavin biosynthesis, or vitamin B2, and we're studying that as a target for novel antibiotics because of the growing threat of antibiotic resistance. In addition to my primary projects studying the enzymes of riboflavin biosynthesis, I also study a protease from COVID, and I look at it complexed with novel inhibitors from one of the labs that we collaborate with. They synthesize these inhibitors, and so my job is to set up crystals and see if we can determine the unique structures of how the protein is interacting with those inhibitors. So obviously, if you're here, you're considering working in the United States at some point over your careers. And really, you're not alone. Since 2000, the share of foreign-born workers in the STEM workforce in the US has increased by more than 40%. So obviously, there's a lot of great opportunities here in the United States, and we're going to discuss some of those today. So if you are thinking about taking advantage of a number of these opportunities, I would definitely encourage you to do so. But first, you need to ask yourself, because I believe that this audience is primarily undergraduates. You should ask yourself do you want to attend graduate school? And the short answer is, if you want to do a career in research or STEM, you should absolutely go to graduate school to give yourself the most room for growth along that career trajectory, as most STEM and research jobs would require graduate training. Now, there is an exception in that there are technician jobs available that do not require a graduate degree. Most of them would just require a bachelor's degree. However, these are not training positions, and in the United States, you generally have to be minimally trained to do a specific job prior to being hired. For example, so I'm using a number of examples throughout this presentation, and they're of jobs at UTSA, which is the institution I'm at now. If you wanted to be hired as a technician within the chemistry department here at UTSA, that full-time position would be $31,200 a year, which actually sounds really great. But make sure wherever you decide to go next, wherever in the world that may be, you factor in the cost of living. My understanding is that the cost of living in the US is much higher, so this money won't go as far as it necessarily would in Brazil. But that's true even within the United States. There are certain parts of the United States where this salary would not be a livable wage. So definitely research the area that you're considering moving to get an idea of how much you would need to make to be able to live a secure lifestyle. Technician jobs are not very secure. They're contingent on continued grant funding. And we're going to discuss funding throughout this talk today, but funding is very hard to come by in the United States. And I hope that later during the open discussion, Thiago can weigh in on his thoughts of funding in the United States versus Brazil. So required qualifications listed for this technician position would be a bachelor's degree in chemistry or chemical engineering or related field. Now you can imagine if you have, let's say, a biochemistry background, if you were doing a biochemistry technician position, you would need a bachelor's in, let's say, biochemistry and experience in biochemical research, because they would require you have basic understanding of lab equipment ordinarily used for the type of work you would be doing. And a key note here is that applicants selected for this position must be able to show proof of eligibility to work in the United States by the time of being hired. And that's really the trickiest part too, is getting your visas to be sponsored appropriately. So that's another reason why I would recommend, if you're really considering working at the US at some point, to pursue a graduate degree here in the United States. I think that, so let's talk first about what graduate degrees really are. I'm sure that you all are well aware, so we'll quickly go through this slide. Typically, when you think of a graduate degree, you think of a master's or a PhD. So a master's is generally a 2-year degree. Here in the United States, it's not sponsored, so you have to pay for your tuition. Whereas a PhD is a longer degree, typically 4 to 7 years, depending on what field you go into. But your PI pays for your stipend, which is your salary, the income you get, and the tuition to cover your classes associated with getting that degree. So this degree does not cost you anything, whereas a master's would. For you to obtain your PhD and graduate, you typically have to make a new contribution to your respective field. And graduate programs, they have different rules for what it takes to graduate. So many programs would require at least one first author publication to graduate. Some don't. So you would need to look into whatever program you're interested in and make sure you understand what the requirements are for graduation. In the United States, you do not need to complete a master's degree prior to starting your PhD. So, and I think that's one of the key differences that Thiago and I had discussed is, for instance, I don't have a master's degree. I went directly from my bachelor's into the PhD program. In fact, some graduate institutions here in the United States don't even offer masters. Like the one I did, signing up to get a master's degree was not an option. It was only a PhD. So certainly you don't need a master's prior to applying to graduate school in the United States. So what is my personal experience with getting a PhD? So anywhere around the world, graduate school is going to be tough, but hopefully very rewarding. As a graduate student, I worked over the 40-hour week. A lot of this does depend on lab expectations. I think it's very important for you to maintain a healthy work-life balance, but certainly expect to work at least 40 hours a week, just so you can progress your project. Typically, you would complete your coursework in the first 2 years, and then you would focus on research for the remaining years. So in biochemistry and biophysics, a typical PhD would last 4 to 6 years. So you would end up doing 2 to 4 years of highly intense research after you finish those first 2 years of coursework. My personal program required at least one first author publication to graduate. As I mentioned earlier, this is not true across the board for every institution. I think this is really good, though, that they required that first author publication because it helps you get the job after that. So certainly if getting a first author publication is not a requirement of your program, you should certainly strive for that in graduate school, just so you're better set up to get another job after graduate school. Over the course of graduate school, you are encouraged typically to apply for something called external funding. So as I said earlier, your PI, if you're a PhD student, your PI or your boss will pay for your stipend and tuition. If you get external funding, you're essentially giving the lab money to pay for those tuition and stipend. And so it doesn't come out of your PI's budget. So it would be important for you to find fellowships available to non-US citizens. Now, whether or not this is necessary for you to obtain external funding will depend on whether or not your PI has money for you over the course, let's say 5 years for your PhD. And I would definitely put a star, like if you're taking notes or anything, make a note to ask your PI whenever you're trying to find what lab to join, to definitely talk to them and make sure they have money for you for the time you will be in their lab. So, because you don't want to get, let's say, 3 years into your PhD and then they lose funding. And then you have to, let's say, switch labs and switch projects. That can really add time onto your graduate degree that you don't want to add. So that being said, grad school is tough no matter what. So make sure it's what you want. And there is no shame in changing direction if you are on a path that doesn't lead to your ultimate happiness. So there is a system, I'm going to say, within the United States where it's called mastering out. So let's say I'm 2 years into my PhD and I realize that research isn't for me and that what I want to do long term would only require a master's degree. There are many options that I could do that would allow me to master out. So since I've met the degree requirement for a master's degree, I can say, hey, I'm just going to leave with a master's instead of going the additional 4 years to get a full doctorate of philosophy degree. And so even though my graduate program did not offer a master's, like I couldn't enter wanting a master's, they allowed individuals in that program to master out if they decided that they didn't want to get the whole PhD. And actually several people while I was in graduate school did that, and they were much happier for it. So some qualities that I think graduate school requires would be resilience, focus, and determination, because it's going to be tough. So just make sure it's what you want and you're doing it for yourself. Okay, so let's zoom in on graduate school here at UTSA. So here's a map of the US, and down here at the bottom, the star in the middle of the great state of Texas is San Antonio, and that's where UTSA is located. If you would like to learn more about San Antonio, here's my shameless self-promotion of both myself and Tiago, is he and I were both asked to write a short piece about our city for the American Society for Biochemistry and Molecular Biology. So I will send this presentation to Vivian at the end of the talk, and that way if she wants to disseminate this to her people, she can. But if you are interested in looking at San Antonio, definitely go to the ASBMB website, because the annual meeting for 2024 of ASBMB is going to be here in San Antonio. So they're doing a lot of promotion, talking about what a great city it is to visit and to do research in. So if you, after this talk, UTSA is one of the places that you're interested in considering for graduate school, definitely take advantage of the resources given in the ASBMB. So let's say you are interested in pursuing graduate school at UTSA. If you go to the graduate school website, there's a whole tab for international students. And if you click on that tab, it will take you to the International Services Portal. Now, obviously, I am a U.S. native, and the set of hurdles that an international student will have to overcome, I am unfamiliar with. Therefore, I strongly advise you communicate directly with the institution that you are looking at pursuing your degree at. And take advantage of whatever online resources they have available, like on this International Services Portal. So there's a number of resources given on this page. One of those is something called a presentation library. Basically what it is a collection of videos over various topics that would be very pertinent to an international student, such as employment and graduation, immigration updates for F1 students, employment and career resources, academic health plans, international student and scholar tax. So taxes, I can't speak for other countries, but taxes in the US are like crazy confusing. So absolutely take advantage of the resources that are posted online. And I can say that I think UTSA has a number of great resources available to support international students. Something you also need to consider whenever you are picking an institution, make sure you pick an institution that has a lot of supports available for international students, because your stipend can go away if your PI loses funding, or if your PI only has funding through an agency that requires the beneficiaries of it be U.S. citizens, then you wouldn't be able to work under a particular grant, for instance. So make sure you have an in-depth discussion with your potential boss to make sure that your funding will be secured. Working at an institution like UTSA, which has undergraduates, your stipend can actually be covered by you working as a teaching assistant. So in the event that your PI loses funding, you can actually TA, and it will cover the cost of your stipend and tuition. This is not true of all institutions. Because the graduate school I went to was actually a medical school, there were not undergraduate students there. So in the event of our PI losing funding, he had to apply for something called bridge funding through the department. And in that situation, international students were not eligible to receive that funding because of some weird, obscure rules deemed necessary by the state. I'm not sure why. And so that was one of the things that international students had to be aware of before applying for graduate school at UTMB, is that if they lost funding, they would have to definitely switch labs. Like I said, working at a school with undergraduates, you can work as a TA and you can cover your stipend and your tuition costs in that way, which is obviously a much more secure situation than at other institutions. So what are some of the differences between having a PhD in the United States versus Brazil? So these numbers are from Google, and I am not an expert on the differences in like the international education systems, or even the US education system. But according to a quick Google search, Brazil has a higher rate of unemployment for those holding a PhD than those in the United States. The US PhD unemployment rate is 1.4% as of September 2023, and I provided the link there. Brazil's PhD unemployment rate for graduates is higher. 25% don't have formal employment after graduating. And there's a link to this great article out of Nature. And so if you're interested, I would strongly encourage you read this article. Now, I realize that these two numbers that I presented to you are different in that the top metric for the United States was all PhDs, versus the bottom number for Brazil was just those newly graduated PhDs. So absolutely do your own research, but I think overall it stands that there are a number of great opportunities in the United States that I would encourage you to explore. And really, that's the question of what comes after grad school. Well, for most of you, you're going to need a job. And the standard trajectory that most people would take would be to do a postdoc position. And what a postdoc is it's still a training position. So that's what Thiago and I are now. It's still a training position, but we are no longer students. So we've already graduated with our PhDs. We're not a student anymore, but we realize that we need to gain expertise in another area so that we could be a really good PI, let's say, at running our own lab. There's still some skills that we need to acquire. So for this type of position, because we're no longer a student, we're not expected on paper to work over the 40-hour week. We're salaried, so we'll work the 40-hour week. And because most institutions would not want to pay like us overtime. So you should cap your work at what you're getting paid. So that would be 40 hours a week. Now, there are a number of ways that doing a postdoc can benefit you for a particular career path. Let's say you want to stay in academia. Typically, doing a postdoc is essential. And over the course of your postdoc, you'll increase your network, you'll increase your number of publications, you'll gain new training experiences, etc. And what this all does is will increase how competitive you are for future jobs. Like I said, especially for those in academia. However, many people do, after a postdoc, decide to go into different fields. So one of those is a university lecturer. And like I said, that's what I wanted to do when I started my PhD. My vision for myself changed, and I wanted to do something more research heavy. So a university lecturer is what they're called in the United States. My understanding is that in Brazil, they're called temporary professors. And what this is a strictly teaching position. You don't do research. You're not responsible for running your own lab. If you're interested in just teaching in the United States, you could also teach high school because schools pay more to teachers with those graduate degrees. So you would get several thousand more dollars a year just because you hold a graduate degree. And so if that's something, depending on like what age of student you enjoy having, that's something for you to consider if you don't want to do research anymore. There's a number of industry positions. So in the fields of biochemistry, there's a lot of biotech startups that are hiring recent PhD graduates. In the fields of chemistry, of course, there's a lot of drug synthesis, organic synthesis, drug design laboratories in industry because, of course, they would need to be very industrious in making large-scale preps of different compounds for drug discovery efforts. Now, there's also government jobs in the United States, and so beware of the government jobs. I don't know what the citizenship requirements are in the United States for every government position, but there's a number of like really cool opportunities. Like, so NASA, for instance, would be a government job. There's NASA, the USDA, the CDC. All of those would be considered government positions that would still enable you to do research. There's also ways, if you're interested in influencing policy, going into government positions that are no longer research intensive, but where you would advise on policy development to be more inclusive or better support scientific research. There's also patent law. That would require a PhD or some understanding of intellectual property and generation of novel ideas. So if you this would be actually a more lucrative or higher earning position if you would like to go to law school. So my understanding of patent law positions would be is typically if you got your PhD, you could go to a law firm and they would actually pay for you to get your law degree. So they would pay for you to go to law school if they liked you enough and you did a good enough job for them. So certainly if pursuing the legal side of science is something you're interested in, investigate those types of positions. There are a number of professional organizations. One of those was ASBMB, which I mentioned earlier. There are full-time staff who actually run those organizations, and they're all scientists or were at some point, and they want to stay immersed in the scientific community. And so what they do is they work really hard to provide resources to scientists who are actively researching at the bench, just like those little articles that they helped us format and disseminate to the scientific community of our own. There are scientific writing positions, both technical and non-technical. So for instance, if you're interested in speaking more about scientific policy, that would be like non-technical writing. But if you wanted to talk about new ideas that that are coming up in your respective field, that would be more like a technical piece. There's consultant positions. And if you really enjoy traveling, you could consider working as a sales rep for a company. They get to travel around a lot to different places, to different labs, and talk to a number of different groups. So if those are things that you enjoy, maybe being a sales rep for one of these companies is right for you. There's many more options than this. This is just what I could list on a slide without the font getting too small. And this is one of the things that really separates the United States, I think, from other countries, is the number of different jobs that we have that you can pursue after getting your PhD. So I just threw so many different options at you. How do you know what path is right for you? Well, ultimately, you have to self-reflect and really think about what will make you happy long-term and what's sustainable. This can be very daunting, especially for people early on in their careers who don't have a really good idea of what they want to do. So one resource that can help is the American Association for the Advancement of Science's My IDP page. So like I said, I'm going to email these slides to Vivian. I think that this is absolutely fantastic resource. The link is here on this slide. Basically, what this will link you to is a science personality quiz, if you will, and it helps you identify your goals, your interests, and your values. And then based on what your goals, interests, and values are, it will suggest to you potential careers. The responses, your responses to this quiz should change over time. So I would recommend you revisit it, every year or two, or whenever you're approaching a big change in your job. Like maybe let's say you're approaching your graduation, either of undergraduate or graduate school. I would recommend you retake this quiz and make sure whatever next steps you take are steps that will make you happy. So for example, getting married and for in my case, like having a child changed what locations I'm willing to look for a job in, because my husband will also need to be able to find a job in that location. So we need a location that has career opportunities for both of us. So whereas if I was single without a child, location wouldn't matter as much to me. It would just be strictly where I could find a job. Now I place a higher value on location because my husband needs to have to be able to find a job there as well. And that's just one example of a change that can occur over time. So for example of what comes out of it. So this is my top careers by the MyIDP website. So what it says it recommends to me would be top pick would be research staff in a research intensive institution. So that would be like a staff scientist or researcher in academia or government lab, a lab manager, or a director of a multi-user research facility in an academic institution. And it scored me with an 89% skills match and a 79% interest match. But if you look at the next field here, combined research and teaching careers, and that would be a faculty at a liberal arts college or university whose job includes both research and major teaching responsibilities. It actually scored me a higher interest match to that career, but a lower skills match because maybe, let's say, I don't have as much formal undergraduate teaching experience as what would typically be required for that position. So, and I was actually really happy with these because I think they were spot on. And I think it speaks to what I said earlier in the talk. I originally started graduate school to be a lecturer, which was strictly a teaching position. And then over the course of my graduate degree, I fell in love with the process of doing research and being at the bench. And you can actually see those responses shining in the results of this because all my top picks have to do with either research, teaching, or some combination thereof. But what I thought was really interesting wasn't necessarily my top careers, but my bottom careers. So if you look at the very, very bottom, entrepreneurship, let's say I wanted to start my own company. So I have a 74% skills match, which I think is being generous, and a 55% interest match. And man, that's also generous. I have no interest in starting my own company. So this quiz, the scientific personality quiz, was right on the money for me as far as what it kind of picked as my top careers and my bottom. But what's really cool is also looking at the careers in the middle that maybe weren't things that I had previously thought of before, like doing an intellectual property and things like that. So if you're thinking about getting a job in the United States, I would really recommend you go to graduate school here. It's a great way to try living in the United States without having to find a company that will support any like visa or anything like that, because graduate schools have built-in supports for international students. It's very common for students from other countries to go to graduate school here in the United States. So they know how to handle it. They know what advice to give you, which is fantastic. Many companies may not have that same infrastructure in place to help international employees. So graduate school would provide a safe space compared to working at a company. Now, I'm not trying to discourage you if you are wanting to just work at a company here in the States. But certainly make sure you find one that does have supports available to you. So more ways in which graduate school is safe compared to working in a company is, let's say you don't like your PI after you've worked for a few months in their labs. In graduate school, you can always switch labs. I know that I'm making it sound very easy, but there are ways you can do that. And it doesn't have to affect your employment status. And one of the things you get in graduate school is a committee It's a group of faculty members, and it's their job to advocate for you, or they should advocate for you, and hopefully they will. So you have a collection of faculty members in place who their job there is to help you progress on your scientific journey, if you will, which is very different than working at a company where those types of things are not required. So if you're interested in going to graduate school here or getting a job in the US, what would my advice be to you? My top tip would be work on your communication skills. Most, dare I say, every job in the United States requires competency in English. But your English does not have to be perfect by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, most native English speakers don't have perfect English. My advice to you would be to practice as much as possible. Have a really good CV. I don't like overly artistic CVs. Now, that may be my personal opinion. I think that the CV itself should just be a showcase for the content. And what I mean by overly artistic is bold color choices or borders or things like that. The content should speak for itself. And there's a number of great examples online of what a CV recommended for pursuing a career in academia or graduate school look like. For graduate school, you would generally have to write a statement of purpose or some type of personal statement. These are two different documents and they have different goals. So a statement of purpose, which is what UTSA, the institution here, requires, is more like, why do you want to go to graduate school? It's more professionally focused, whereas a personal statement is, I lost some words there, would be, tell me about yourself and your research experience or your STEM experience, anything like that. I would recommend you have someone who, if you're English, if you do not feel confident in it, I would recommend you don't necessarily rely on Google Translate. It doesn't always translate in a grammatically correct way. And so I would recommend you have somebody who is confident in their English look over these documents before submitting them. So if you're interested, like seriously interested in thinking deeply about career paths available to you after you get a PhD, a book that I would recommend you reading would be this Next Gen PhD by Melanie Cinch. Really, she has great advice for networking, preparing your CV, like what components should be included on a CV, what's a CV versus a resume, and ultimately interviewing strategies. She gives a lot of questions that typically crop up in interviews for different types of positions. And sometimes, it's just things that you have never thought about before, and you certainly don't want to be trying to compute an answer right there in front of the person interviewing you. So this is a really great book. In fact, every year, the chair of the chemistry department here at UTSA does a book club. And this is the book she presents because she thinks it's so important and so helpful to graduate students and postdocs on their professional journeys. So in short, I strongly advise you think carefully about your career path and only make choices that help you reach your goal. And your goal should be to be happy. Your goal shouldn't be to be a PhD. Your goal should be to be happy. And if research fulfills you or patent law fulfills you, then take steps that will enable you to do what makes you happy. Research potential PhD programs or any job opportunities. So rely heavily on the internet, but don't be afraid to reach out to administrators, to talk to them and ask them questions. In fact, that's how I got into graduate school in the first place, was I was actually past the deadline for submitting, but I called up one of the people because I had a question about the program because I was going to apply for the next year. I had a question about the program, and it came up in conversation that they still had an opening for one slot, and they wanted to interview me because they liked my transcripts and my grades as an undergraduate. And the rest is history. I got in late to the program. Of course, it was before the semester started, but because I made that phone call and talked and asked questions and expressed my serious interest, they worked with me. Work on your science communication skills. So that can be oral. So you'll need to interview well and make great presentations, as well as written, because your CV and documents like your statement of purpose are very important for getting a job. And then work diligently towards success. So research is difficult. I mean, it has to be because you're doing stuff nobody's ever done before. But remember that your results do not define you. You're more than your research. Sometimes your experiments just don't work, and that's okay. You'll figure it out. At every stage of your career, ask yourself if you are living your dream or working towards what will make you happy. If you're not, seriously redirect to a more fulfilling path, because nothing is worth your happiness at the end of the day. So now I would like to open it up to a discussion, and I put my email at the bottom of the slide here in case anyone wants to jot that down or have it when I send the slides after this talk. And that way you have it. So please feel free to ask any questions.
Ok. Gostaria primeiro de agradecer a Zoe, foi uma palestra maravilhosa. E temos algumas perguntas aqui, né? Primeira pergunta. So, Zoe, the first question, can you see that? Yeah, so she's asking in English, if you want to answer.
Thank you so much for this question. Is it possible without my graduation? Okay, so you're asking if you haven't graduated yet, or is it possible to start looking for graduate opportunities in the United States? Absolutely. So I would pick out your top universities that you're interested in pursuing and do a little bit of research on them, and reach out to their teams, like their administrators there, because their contact information will be listed, and talk with them specifically. Because like I said, in my case, I was late applying. Now I realized I'd already graduated at that point, but because I talked to them, they gave me specific information that was helpful to me in my situation. And talking to people will give them the opportunity to help you in your specific situation. Because let's say there's a difference between being like, I'm going to graduate in the spring versus I'm going to graduate in 3 years. And they can help you judge what's the best strategy for applying.
Uma coisa mais que eu gostaria de acrescentar é esse modelo sanduíche de integração entre universidades. Normalmente você faz pela universidade que você está no momento. Por exemplo, eu fiz um doutorado sanduíche aqui nos Estados Unidos e eu consegui uma bolsa pela CAPES para que eu fizesse isso, né? Porque eu parti da Universidade de São Paulo para a Universidade de Indianápolis. Então, isso normalmente é financiado pelo governo em que você está sediado. Então, no caso de um doutorado sanduíche, por exemplo, você teria que pegar uma bolsa da CAPES, ou FAPESP, ou FAPEMIG, ou CNPq, se você está fazendo a sua graduação no Brasil, certo? Então, o modelo sanduíche, normalmente, ele é financiado no Brasil. Aqui nos Estados Unidos não tem muito esse modelo de financiamento. É mais financiamento para projetos em si. Não, existem dentro da universidade esse tipo de financiamento, mas aí são para os alunos que estão aqui, né? Então, no caso, seria uma bolsa financiada pelo Brasil. So, next question, she's thanking you, and she's asking, so is the graduate school here helping people to get in the job market in the US, or is just heavy academia oriented?
That is a fantastic question. And I actually think that the graduate school here is very open to, like here at UTSA, and actually in my experience across the board, is very open to encouraging people to pursue positions in, let's say, industry. So my personal experience in graduate school is every year UTMB would hold basically it was like a job fair where they had previous graduates come back who went into different industries and come back and talk to the current students about different career opportunities. And so, of course, we got people who were in patent laws, people who went to government jobs like at NASA come back, and we had people who ended up going into, like, let's say AstraZeneca or Pfizer, doing research and coming back and talking about how they transitioned from being a graduate student there at UTMB to being a researcher. Those were like more research positions, or in the case of the patent lawyer, a lawyer position. But here at UTSA, I see very much the same thing. Examples would include that book club that I mentioned that's open to graduate students. This is within the chemistry department, and I'm not sure exactly what specific major you are and what you would be interested in pursuing. And I'm sure there's comparable programs in every department. Actually, a lot of the time we talked about jobs outside of academia, because we all know people who are professors that we can easily access and talk to them about their career trajectory and get advice from. However, we're not necessarily exposed to people who work at NASA or are patent lawyers. And that was one of the things that, let's say, our chair had done last year, she said, was actually have Zoom calls with people from those industries just for certain book clubs where those classes were really interested in those certain careers. Outside of just the chemistry department, the graduate school here at UTSA offers a ton of workshops about getting like your CV or your resume prepped for moving into an industry type position. Also look at those professional meetings. So even if your graduate school itself doesn't offer anything, a lot of those professional organizations like ASBMB today, or ASBMB, have different career fairs where they have like a meet and greet with people from different industries. So absolutely, there are options available to you if you're interested in talking to people from outside of academia and getting advice from them.
So the next question is similar to the other one. So Leticia is asking how the universities in US prepare students for the graduate school, from the graduate school to the job market, and to continue in academia. Like, how is that preparation?
Okay, so building off of my last answer, I think something else I want to add is that the universities will have a lot of tools available to you, like various workshops that I mentioned, and membership in like these professional organizations are encouraged. But I also want to put a little bit of the weight, if you will, on you as students, because you need to take an active role, very active role in acquiring the skills you need to be successful in the next career steps. So you absolutely need to do research on your own, in addition to all of those resources that I mentioned as an answer to the previous question. And actually, the way I got this job now was I went to a meeting, the Biophysical Society meeting in San Diego in 2020, before COVID locked everything down. It was in February of 2020, where I met a professor who I didn't know at the time would have such an impact on my life. I met with him, and later, whenever I had reached out, because COVID had shut everything down, I had to take time between graduating from graduate school and starting a postdoc, because that's whenever I gave birth to my son. And so I was having a lot of trouble breaking back into research because it's so competitive, and doing postdocs is very competitive. And so I reached out to him seeking advice, and he's actually who connected me with Dr. Lamb, my current boss. And so really, I think the best preparation you can do, and it's not something your university can do for you, is to grow your network. That is the best advice I have, but only you can do that. Your university may provide you outlets too, but you're going to have to be the one to get over your nerves and self-doubt to actually reach out and talk to people, because that's what I did with this person who I respect tremendously, and it really ended up shaping my career.
Yeah, Apenas acrescentando, eu vejo aqui, gente, que o doutorado e o mestrado, né, principalmente o doutorado, que é o que mais tem aqui comum, isso te prepara demais para a indústria. A maioria das pessoas que fazem doutorado aqui, elas saem para a indústria, elas não ficam na academia, porque nós temos oportunidades de emprego aqui. Uma coisa que no Brasil, depois que você termina o doutorado, você fica ou desempregado, ou você faz um bico, ou faz qualquer coisa diferente. Então, essa é a grande diferença da universidade e da indústria aqui, né? A gente tem um país extremamente desenvolvido industrialmente. Então, a indústria absorve a maioria dos doutores que são formados aqui nos Estados Unidos. Essa é uma grande vantagem. Então, fica na academia quem quer. Quem quer ir para a indústria tem toneladas de vagas, assim, sobrando para você. E, normalmente, a indústria paga mais do que a academia. Então, acaba que muita gente vai mais para a indústria do que fica na academia. Mas a preparação é com a experiência e com o networking, como a Zoe falou. Principalmente isso, assim, networking, para que você tenha os contatos necessários para crescer na sua carreira. Okay, next question. From Brida. She's asking how you get into the master or PhD program in the US. Is it by a test? How do you know about it? How can you get in university to do the graduate school?
Great question. So there is no test anymore that is required. Before, we had to take a test. So like whenever I applied for graduate school, I had to take a test called the GRE. That is no longer required. You just need your bachelor's degree and your official transcripts, whatever documentations your particular graduate program would require. As far as finding graduate programs, really the internet. Unless you have a network to rely on, I would suggest you start looking for who's publishing in areas of research that interest you and see where those institutions are. Or if you have your heart set on working in a certain geographical location, look there specifically at those universities and see whose research is interesting to you there. That's going to require a lot of research on your end. But certainly all of that information is available on the internet. You just have to look for it.
Okay, next question. Let's see. So Isabella, she's asking, how is the job market for engineering here? Engineers.
So engineers typically don't require graduate degrees in the United States. So in Texas, so it depends on what type of engineer you are. In Texas, like chemical engineering is really big because we have like oil fields out in the Gulf of Mexico. So if you think back to my map and where San Antonio was, then you have the Gulf of Mexico there. There's like so many different plants there where chemical engineers get hired on readily. So one of the things I learned whenever I was an undergraduate, just talking to my colleagues that were engineers or engineering undergraduate students, was that it doesn't help them typically to get a graduate degree in engineering. In many ways, that's only if you want to go into academia to be some type of professor in engineering. The other thing that I noticed, because I was friends with a chemical engineer in graduate school, was that they encouraged her to get an MBA, which is a Master's of Business Association and Administration, excuse me. And the MBA was because she was in such a high management position. They wanted to make sure that she had the skills to manage her team appropriately. So they actually paid for her to do that MBA. So really, it depends on the type of engineer you are and where in the United States, if that field is thriving. So again, chemical engineers in Southeast Texas, booming. I don't know what the chemical engineering job market would be in other areas of the country.
Então, basicamente, depende muito da região que você está interessada em se mudar e qual é a engenharia que você trabalha, né? Digamos assim, porque existem... Aqui as coisas são mais separadas por regiões. Então, por exemplo, aqui no Texas tem muito essa coisa do petróleo, né? Então, os engenheiros químicos aqui são muito valorizados por conta disso. Então, vai depender muito da área que você está relacionada. certo? Próxima pergunta. So Laura is asking, oh, so she's asking from your perspective, if the foreigners, they have difficulties to have fellowships here, financed by US.
That is a great question. There are many funding opportunities that are only available to U.S. citizens. That being said, there are a number of international fellowships that are also available. So you would have to look on most graduate school websites. They'll have lists for if you for funding opportunities. They'll have lists of funding opportunities and what the general requirements are for each one. So if it's like to be a U.S. citizen, it will specify that. But certainly that is something that's very serious. Now, there are opportunities available, but they would be very different from the number of opportunities. There would be far fewer opportunities than if you were a U.S. citizen.
Particularmente falando, gente, eu tentei aplicar para algumas bolsas aqui e realmente existem muitas bolsas que são baseadas em pessoas americanas somente, né? Então, para estrangeiros acaba sendo um pouquinho mais difícil do que para quem é americano, tá? Mas existem oportunidades também para você aplicar. Oh, yes. So Zoe está me falando aqui que não é necessariamente exigido que você busque financiamento fora sempre. Normalmente, quando você é contratado, você vem para fazer um doutorado, o seu pesquisador, né, o seu orientador, ele vai ter um dinheiro para você. Você pode ser um teaching assistant, por exemplo, você pode auxiliar nas aulas do professor e isso te dá um salário que paga tudo o que você precisa para fazer o seu doutorado. Então, existem bolsas que normalmente o próprio pesquisador vai ter para você se ele resolver te contratar, te trazer para fazer o doutorado, certo? Então, isso é um pouco diferente no Brasil. No Brasil, a gente apenas precisa de bolsa, senão não tem como fazer o doutorado. Aqui, normalmente, os próprios pesquisadores têm as bolsas para trazer alunos, tá? Então, não é uma coisa independente. Você é mais dependente do pesquisador aqui do que no Brasil. Beleza? Next question. Obrigada pela palestra. Oh, so Hayani is asking, how are the partnership between companies and educational institutions and how they are impacting the formation and recruitment of engineers in US?
So I don't know how to completely answer that question because that would be outside of my area of expertise as far as it's specific to engineering goes. I can say during my graduate school, we collaborated with AstraZeneca to do high throughput screening for activators and inhibitors of glutamate dehydrogenase. And so we searched through their drug library. They allowed us access to that library free of charge, and they gave us like a small amount of money in order to do the screens. Typically, whenever you work with companies, the results will be sort of proprietary because they're the ones funding the research. And so it does impact how you're able to publish those results. I'm sorry, that's the best I can answer that question because I'm not really sure how it directly or would specifically affect engineering. But I hope my answer was helpful.
Okay, next question. Okay, so you can read that.
I can read. So do I have any recommendations to apply for schools in the US? Yes. So absolutely. The first thing they're going to see about you typically would be all of your written documents, as well as your transcripts from your undergraduate degree. Make sure these documents are in order and in that they're well written. Like I said earlier in my talk, Google Translate doesn't always translate in the most grammatically correct way. So definitely get somebody who is confident in whatever country you're applying to, in the case of English, like if they're confident in English, to read over it and make sure it's grammatically correct. Now, that being said, these documents, they don't have to be perfect, but they absolutely should reflect how serious you are as a candidate. So really take some time to understand the difference between, like, let's say a personal statement and a statement of purpose. There are different tiers of universities as well. Some universities have higher acceptance rates than others. And so that's something else that you should look at whenever you're applying is don't get discouraged. If you apply to a school it's very difficult to get into and you don't get in, don't be discouraged by that, because certainly most people, whenever they apply to places, they get mostly rejected. But the only thing you can really do is control the documents that you put in, which would be work on your personal statement, your CV, and make sure that those are well-written documents that show that you're a thoughtful candidate.
Okay, next one. Oh, so that's Fifia. So she's happy to receive you, and she's congratulating for the talk.
Oh, thank you. I was so happy to be here. Obrigada. Don't laugh.
So, oh, incredible talk.
Oi, eu queria aproveitar e fazer mais uma perguntinha para vocês. Eu queria saber qual a importância do inglês, da gente saber falar o inglês para fazer pesquisa nos Estados Unidos. Como que está acontecendo isso? Se é mais maleável ou se a gente tem que ter um inglês mais avançado para conseguir ingressar na linha de pesquisa.
Okay, so she's asking how important is the English level to come to US to make research. I think you can.
So I will answer this question based on the proficiency in English I see in, let's say, graduate students here at UTSA. And this is where it also depends on what program or how competitive the program is and how good your documents are going into it. There are some students in this particular program who I would say have like a low proficiency in English, but they're still thriving within the program. I think that obviously they probably face challenges in courses because the courses are in English. So as long as they have a working understanding of what they're supposed to be learning, or they're able to either like slowly translate it on their own. Let's say they had the course materials and they're able to translate it on their own time. They are still extremely successful. So I would not discourage anyone from applying strictly based on their level of English proficiency, but be aware if your documents are not competitive or 100% correctly written, they may make you a less competitive applicant for the position. And so that's what I was trying to say earlier, as far as don't get discouraged. If you apply for a hard to get into program, it most likely has nothing to do with you personally, but just that the program itself didn't have many slots available. And if you are not as proficient in English as, say, somebody else, or you're not as competitive on paper as somebody else, then they unfortunately have to like vote on a committee to be like who's admitted, and you may not make the cut. But certainly I don't want to discourage anyone from applying. I would say regardless of level of English proficiency, please apply, and really the right program will find you at that point. If it's meant to be, you'll get in.
Eu vou falar sobre a minha experiência. A primeira vez que eu vim para os Estados Unidos, eu tinha um inglês intermediário. E o que eu posso dizer é, o inglês não é determinante no seu processo de seleção, mas é óbvio que você precisa ter, ao mínimo, um inglês que você consiga se comunicar e atender aos cursos. Nós temos pessoas aqui no nosso departamento que praticamente não se comunicam, que são do doutorado, né, fazem doutorado em Química, e que estão aí, estão fazendo pesquisa, estão publicando, mas não conseguem se comunicar muito bem no inglês. Às vezes o inglês escrito, ele é muito mais importante por conta disso, porque você consegue ainda ler e fazer tudo o que você precisa, né? mas a comunicação também é essencial dentro da ciência, né? Então, é necessário, mas uma vez que você está aqui, você consegue evoluir muito mais rápido dentro da língua, porque você é forçado a isso, né? Então, assim, tente atingir o inglês intermediário. Esse tem que ser o primeiro goal, primeiro objetivo. Quando você tiver esse inglês intermediário, você consegue já aplicar, fazer uma preparação de documentação boa, e a partir daí você tem que trabalhar todo dia. Eu não vou mentir, gente, é puxado, tá? Principalmente quando você chega, para você estar dentro daquela cultura, falar inglês o tempo todo, é difícil, é muito difícil. Você, no começo, você vai ralar muito até você se adaptar. Mas é uma coisa que o cérebro se adapta e você, com o tempo, vai progredindo. E só tende a melhorar, não tem como piorar a partir desse momento, certo? Então, a partir do momento que você consegue um inglês intermediário suficiente para que você faça uma aplicação, aí você consegue progredir. Então, é basicamente isso, assim. Tem um intermediário e se joga de cabeça e estuda, óbvio, né? Continua sempre tentando melhorar o seu inglês, como essa palestra aqui, a Zoe está aqui, principalmente para ajudar vocês com o inglês, né? O inglês, ele é essencial no mundo, infelizmente, né? O inglês, ele é essencial, ele é a língua que todo mundo fala. E a ciência fala inglês, então a gente precisa saber inglês. Então a gente tem que se esforçar e tentar sempre melhorar um pouquinho, ok?
Maravilhoso, Thiago. E Zoe, muito obrigada. A gente está recebendo vários comentários positivos sobre a palestra. A gente queria agradecer, eu agradeço em nome da LMDP e ao SIMBITEC, né? E por vocês terem aberto a nossa noite. E a gente vai dar por encerrado o nosso primeiro dia de SIMBITEC. Amanhã teremos, né, uma mesa redonda que a gente falará sobre a influência dos projetos científicos no âmbito profissional. Será uma entrevista toda em português com ex-alunos do LMDP contando a sua experiência no mercado de trabalho. Então, eu vou
Ok,
deixar abaixo o
obrigado,
nosso...
pessoal. Obrigado a todo mundo que está aí, valeu pela presença.
Obrigada. Thanks, everybody. That's the extent of my Portuguese.
Obrigada, Zoe. Thank you. Aguardamos a participação de todos, né? Não deixe de seguir a nossa página do Instagram, do LinkedIn, assim como deixar o seu link para a gente seguir a sua página no YouTube também. E, mais uma vez, se inscrevam no nosso canal. Boa noite.